The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, Carbon Tax, Economic, Climate, and Demographic Implications. This webinar is being presented by Dr. Fred Treyz, CEO and Chief Economist at REMI, Tomas Bentley, Economic Assistant at REMI, David Casaza, an Associate at REMI, and Ethan Ackerman, an Economic Assistant at REMI. I'm Brian Reel, Marketing and Event Coordinator at REMI, and I'll be hosting this webinar. At REMI, we provide economic modeling solutions that help policymakers make more informed policy decisions. Our models are built for any state, county, or combination of counties. We project economic and demographic effects of policies relating to tax, energy and environment, transportation, economic development, equity, and more. I encourage you to reach out to info@remi.com if you're interested in our models, and we would gladly set up a demo. If at any point during this presentation you have a question, please put your question in the question box. After the presentation finishes, I will moderate these questions to the presenters. If we don't get to your question by the end of the hour, we'll be sure to reach out to you personally. And another reminder that a link containing the slides and a recording of this presentation will be sent to you shortly after the webinar ends. If you have any questions based on these materials, I encourage you to reach out to info@remi.com and we'll connect you with the speakers. Take it away, Fred.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. So what this presentation is about is about the climate crisis, basically a slow-moving crisis of climate change, which is linked to the rise of carbon in the economy, and then linked into extreme weather. And it's being exacerbated by greenhouse gases. We're also going to say, even if you don't believe that, there's a major push from a number of states and from the federal government to move to a lower carbon economy, and this is something that policymakers need to respond to in terms of like how to adapt to these changes and looking at the economic and cost of these changes. So in recent years, we've experienced extreme weather events, Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, flooding in Houston, Florida hurricanes, wildfires right now in Canada, which have been so extensive they've blanketed the entire northeast region with a thick cloud of smoke more than one time this summer. Phoenix has experienced over 30, 110 degree days. And then when we're speaking with people in the planning community that are looking at making various infrastructure and other investments, especially in the coastal regions that are intended to last for 50 years or longer, they're sort of wondering whether these infrastructure investments should even be made, since over the long term there may be parts of the country that are basically uninhabitable, whether it's heat and wildfires or interior flooding or coastal flooding. This is just sort of the starting point, what we've seen this summer, and expected to get much worse into the future. Now there are a lot of counter arguments, and I mean we're sort of looking at what policy measures do you have to reduce carbon. There's certainly a lot of counter arguments about whether this should be done or whether it's necessary. Some are based on the science, with sort of an idea that the science is the science has been exaggerated, and that these dire predictions are sort of out there to like sort of promote the career of individual scientists rather than representing a true path. There's the argument that this is a global problem, and that any individual action that the United States takes is basically fruitless, because there's carbon being produced in China and India and elsewhere that we don't have any control over. There's the argument that hey, look, the people promoting climate change are like flying around on private jets. So therefore, like Leonardo DiCaprio, he flies around on a private jet. He wants to have climate change, but like, well, isn't that a little hypocritical? So shouldn't we just dismiss the argument that this is a problem whatsoever because of some of the, perceived or apparent hypocrisy of the strongest climate advocates? And there's also an argument is we need to focus on the needs of like here and today. So like people are struggling to put food on their plate, to like pay for gasoline, so that like we really should take priority to like what are the issues of this year or next year, and that should take precedence over like some issue that may be 30 years down the road, and that we should really not pay much attention to long-term issues, but more on the short-term issues. There's also the argument that that carbon should be a matter of personal responsibility. Government shouldn't get involved, and if people want to do better for the environment, they should recycle more and switch to EVs. Okay, so there are a lot of counter arguments out there, but the context that we're dealing with, and we'll show this on a map. Thomas has a nice map that illustrates that. A lot of states and regions in the country have a very ambitious carbon goals. They've set down various regulatory and legislative paths for that. Certainly, with the IRA at the federal level, there's a lot of action in this area, as well as the American Rescue Plan, which is moving forward with charging stations, and various areas need to agree with that. Folks in the automotive industry have to look at this issue, whether it's from a business side or also whether it's questions about what's the future path of the state or regional economy that you live in. And with the industry transforming so quickly, there are literally millions of jobs at stake in terms of a transition into EVs, and like, where do those new jobs go, and what jobs might be eliminated. And states have to deal with, localities have to deal with charging stations everywhere. So these issues are really, very central to the whole sort of construct we have. Sort of the way that we use and produce energy, transportation, heating, a whole different areas, and there are current issues that many areas that we're working with are dealing with. So on with the show then, and Thomas, over to you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Treyz, for helping introduce the subject, in which we will be looking at a carbon tax. So just a little bit, what we're going to go over is the issue at hand, which Dr. Treyz just helped out with to describe a little bit more in depth. So looking at carbon emissions, how the fossil fuel combustion emits the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which causes this greenhouse effect, in which the carbon dioxide traps the heat and is what is deemed a contributing factor to global warming. And with the rise in temperatures comes the weather events, as described, droughts, heat waves, storms. We talked about the hurricanes, the wildfires in Canada, rising sea levels, which has been a big concern for flooding, especially in the coastal cities, and how it is a slow-moving crisis, whereas the severity of the weather issues and effects that we are experiencing now are only going to become more severe and pronounced as we move forward. And this is why this is a very important topic at this moment. And so regardless of where things stand, we have emission targets that are by state, in which they will be challenging to obtain, and that's why we're presenting this to visualize potential solutions to meet these emission targets. So here we have a map that shows all of the states currently that have greenhouse gas emission targets. There are 25 states, including the District of Columbia, with statutory targets, executive, and a mix of both. 5 of these states had emission reduction targets for 2020, and only 1 of them was able to achieve their goals, that being California. So now we can visualize where the emission targets are for each state and how we can achieve those targets in each state. So I want to circle back a little bit. Here's some environmental studies that I highly recommend or encourage you to look at once the PowerPoint is sent. We have helped model carbon taxes in the past, as well as been involved with cap and trade analysis, as well as the low carbon tool with McKinsey, in which moving forward, I want to show how this specific model, how we are involved throughout the process. So this is a very more complex way that can be used. This is a very large PI plus model that was used for this study, in which we see all of the specified policy variables that are fed into the system, and this being a very complicated, complex model with engineered variables from carbon price models, power price models, and showing how all of that can be put into the macroeconomic REMI model and show the output such as GDP, jobs, exports, output, seeing how these policy variables that are being applied to carbon and other industries eventually impacts the all these other states, sectors, industries, and such. So I'm going to introduce regulation, carbon tax, and tax incentives, the main focus being carbon tax, but we want to also show some of the other alternative approaches. So an example with regulation being there's no more internal combustion engines in new vehicles sold in California starting in 2035. That's been a big topic of debate, moving from ICEs, those internal combustion engines, into electric. We have the carbon tax, which we'll be looking at more in depth, the market-based approach that puts a price on each ton of carbon emissions, which we'll go further into, and the tax incentives or the subsidies, in which we are providing the tax credits and rebates for electric vehicles, for instance, and energy efficient improvements in homes, which would include, you put solar panels on your home, or wind farms, other alternative ways to generate, in which we see a combination of regulation, carbon pricing, and these tax incentives can be effective in the reduction of carbon emissions and addressing climate change as a whole. So moving forward with the PowerPoint, I'd like to bring Ethan to help present the rest.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, so moving forward, some of the pros and cons of governmental regulation would include, on the pro side, forward-looking firms are able to develop new technologies. You see that a lot in the EV space with like Toyota, Kia, Hyundai, and a lot of other auto manufacturers kind of piling on to what Tesla started, and they're also doing a lot of new developments with electric vehicles. And then also, policymakers can clearly define needs such as zero-emission vehicles and offshore winds. And also, with regulation, you can achieve economies of scale with a command approach. And then when looking at some of the cons, we have regulations can sometimes be a blunt instrument, as well as, the regulator has a mandate that may or may not consider economic implications or cost, which can be an issue. And then lastly, as the last con, it does not leverage decisions by firms or individuals based on price signals or market information. And then going over some of the pros and cons of subsidies, some of the pros would be it allows for personal choice in the form of incentives rather than a prohibition. And a lot of times they may be more politically feasible. So like a common example of that would be like, the solar rebates that people can choose if they want to add solar panels to their home, or like tax credit that's available for EVs right now, I think, is $7,500, and individuals can make that choice as to whether or not they want to take advantage of those subsidies. And then some cons for subsidies would be that, unfortunately, they still have to be paid for. There's no such thing as free money, so that can happen either in the form of higher taxes or reallocation of budgetary funds. And another con would be that it tends to benefit higher income households. So like I mentioned, the $7,500 EV tax credit, normally higher income households will be the one that are able to, afford some of the, unfortunately, higher end electric vehicles, and maybe the lower income households don't quite have the capital to be able to afford those vehicles and take advantage of those subsidies. And now we're moving into what is a carbon tax. So a carbon tax is a tax imposed by the government on emitters of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide. And the aim with that is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by putting a price on each ton of emissions. This encourages companies and consumers to shift purchases towards less carbon intensive products and services. And then, yeah, by the numbers. So for existing systems, there are 68 direct carbon pricing instruments globally. This includes 36 carbon taxes and 32 emissions trading systems. Some of the countries that have these tools in place include Argentina, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, Denmark, and the European Union. And then for potential revenue generation, a $25 per ton tax of CO2 would lead to an estimated $125 billion of revenue annually. And now going into the pros of a carbon tax, of course, one of the main ones is the reduction of emissions. So by putting a price on carbon emissions, it heavily incentivizes companies and individuals to reduce their carbon footprint. So some experts theorize that a sufficiently high carbon tax would lead to an estimated 20 to 50% reduction of emissions over a 10-year period, as well as controlling purchases. So this carbon tax will let consumers shift their purchase behavior towards lower emission options and carbon intensive goods as they become more expensive. And lastly, of course, it produces revenue, like we went over before. So the revenue generated from this can be used to support climate action plans or support those impacted by higher energy prices. So that will normally be like the lower income, households that didn't have access to or that were more heavily impacted as their budget, energy takes up a larger percent of their budget. Yeah, so cons of a carbon tax, like I was saying, it can be regressive. The average national energy burden for low-income families is 8.6%, which is about 3 times higher than that of a non-low-income household, which is estimated to be about 3%. And then it also can decrease industry competitiveness. Industries may face higher production costs compared to countries without the carbon tax. So especially on like a global level, it can make for firms that rely on lower energy prices much more susceptible to losing competition to some of those foreign firms. And then lastly, it can be politically unpopular. So carbon taxes can be viewed negatively by the public as they can directly increase costs for consumers. And this can happen even in left-leaning states. Like for instance, in the left-leaning state of Washington, they struck down 2 carbon tax initiatives that were on the ballot in both 2016 and 2018. And yeah, I'll be passing it over to one of our associates, David Kazaza, for him to introduce the REMI E3 Plus model.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ethan. Oops. Okay. So we'll be going through 3 different scenarios today. I'll just give a quick kind recap of what those are going to be. But first, if everybody can see, that's the model we have here, but then I apologize. So E3 Plus is our model that deals with, as the name would suggest, energy and the environment, as well as the economy. Essentially, it's built on top of our standard REMI model. You want to think of PI Plus, that's the standard model, and on top of that, we allow for a number of different features. David, this includes mostly carbon dioxide emissions.
Oops, sorry to interrupt, David. You're sharing your Word right now.
Sorry?
You're sharing a Word document right now?
I apologize. I must have switched over. Sorry, this is the risk of having two screens, I guess. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yes, now we can.
E3 Plus capabilities.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, essentially, and we'll see this in a moment with one of our E3 Plus models, but it tracks carbon dioxide emissions, the total cost of carbon, as well as energy consumption. These go into a great amount of detail depending on the sector of the economy that we're looking at, or different kind of broader sectors, industrial, commercial, what have you. When it comes to running specific simulations, it also has some customizable power plant construction policy variables, as well as the cost of fuel and electricity adjustments for those. So those will come in handy when we're talking about these carbon taxes and you know, transitioning from one form of energy over to another one. It'll be important for that. So. So for the first scenario, it's going to be in the state of Washington, again with our E3 Plus model. We'll be going through a fuel cost increase, which we applied to just the natural gas and residual fuel oil portions of the energy sector. And then because this is a carbon tax and dividend scheme, it's similar in some ways to previous schemes that have been formulated by some of our clients who have used the REMI model in the past. Essentially, it's going to be revenue neutral, and anything that's gathered in terms of this effective fuel tax is then going to be distributed via government or via government transfers. So that'll be the first one, the carbon tax. The second one will be a form of a regulation, and this will specifically be dealing with business costs for the automotive industry. As we know, for example, in California, they're setting a deadline of 2035 for there to be no additional internal combustion engine, fossil fuel-based automobile sales. So it'll be essentially modeling how to, or how industries are going to be responding to that change. So in that vein, we'll be having again an increase in business costs for the automotive industry, along with a couple other factors. And that will be conducted by Dr. Trays. And after that, we'll be returning. I'll be returning for the third model simulation. This will be for the California Bay Area economy, again with the PI Plus model. We'll be modeling another possible policy, which is going to be an automobile subsidy, again with this intention of transitioning from fossil fuel-based transportation to electric vehicles. It could be of interest to subsidize this transition to kind of speed it along. You know, there are concerns for the scale of production that's being pursued. So to kind of heighten that transition to that form of production,
could be of interest to policymakers. So I will be showing off our E3+ model now in just a moment. So for the first simulation, this will be our carbon tax scenario. Like I mentioned, this is a single region of the state of Washington. And essentially what our inputs look like are an adjustment to the cost of two types of fuels, natural gas and residual. Electricity is also an option if you want to delve more into that, but for our purposes, if we're looking at a carbon tax, we'll be looking just at these two fuels. There is an alternative kind of way of instituting this. It would be along the lines of a sales tax on specific extractive industries, and that's actually the way that another study from a number of years ago kind of modeled a national simulation. For our purposes, because Washington actually doesn't have any active coal mines, it doesn't have much in the way of active natural gas extraction. Instead, we're just going to be taxing, instead of it being at the point of extraction, we'll be just assuming that there are higher costs for these two types of fuels. And then to essentially make this revenue neutral, we are then going to be distributing that same amount in the form of individual payments from the government, transfer payments. And yeah, so we'll just jump right into the results here. So if you're familiar with the REMI model, if you've attended our webinars in the past, if you're a current user, former user, you'll be familiar with our economic summary tab under the key results. This gives kind of the broad areas to look at, which includes changes to employment, changes to GDP and output, personal income, disposable personal income, the price index, which is essentially tracking the costs overall of goods and services in the economy. And so we'll see from the initial results that we are actually getting some negative values. I'll be going more into why this could be, but broadly, what we're looking at here is that there is an initial kind of shift and a kind of a boon to consumer activity. Right, that's what we're seeing here with an increase in employment and in other economic variables, where people have more money on hand, they're able to spend more on goods and services of various sorts. But over time, because of the increase in the cost of those various fuel categories that we looked at, natural gas and coal, or excuse me, it was residual fuels and coal. We're seeing somewhat of a deleterious impact on the economy as a whole. Again, this is $200 million is kind of a drop in the bucket for a good number of states, particularly Washington State, which is one of the larger ones. But this is sort of just to demonstrate the direction where this might head in. If we go to our employment tab, we can track kind of what's happening by industry. If we go a little bit further, let's say to 2030, the industries that are being most impacted are retail, trade, construction. So it is sort of a general tamping down in some ways of different industries. However, we go to the beginning here, we do see that the industries that we would expect that are most reliant on not just fuel sources in general, but also that residual fuel, which is largely for larger vehicles. We see air transportation, couriers and messengers, sightseeing transportation, transit and ground. So a good number of transportation adjacent and or explicitly transportation industries are being immediately impacted by this policy that we're undertaking. And then we'll show the environmental impacts, and essentially the way we measure this, like I mentioned before, measure through carbon dioxide emissions, the social cost of carbon and energy consumption. We'll be focusing mostly on carbon dioxide emissions and energy consumption here. So we have it broken down, obviously a total measure, as well as residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation. And those are kind of the major sectors of energy use that we're looking at. We can see that there is even a slight increase over those first couple of years, but over time, again, because of not just increasing fuel costs, but also just due to economic impacts. As a result of those fuel costs, we see a general decrease in the consumption, or rather of emissions. Now we can also go to the energy consumption tab here. And rather than looking at emissions, we're also looking at just the usage. So these are measured in billions of BTU. And if we go forward a bit here, we'll notice that essentially all energy usage is down. However, there is one that stands out. It's a very small increase, but it is under residential electricity usage. Best way to think about this is, again, that we are distributing essentially the funds of this tax policy to various citizens. So it would make sense that we're seeing an increase in some residential activity, depending on how the simulation is modeled. For example, I've modeled it as at the source of, at the point of extraction, and then had it as a government distribution from there. You see actually a big boost in various consumer categories, such as real estate purchases and retail trade, healthcare, the demand for healthcare. So a number of different household expenses, money is then kind of put into that because there's more money for the general public on hand. But in this case, with the way this policy was formed, we see only like a modest increase in some of those kind of household expenses. One of them including being electricity usage. So that was our carbon tax scenario. I'm going to hand things off to Dr. Trays to go over the next scenario, which will be dealing with the automobile industry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. I'd like to look at a scenario which I'm calling the regulation scenario, and what is it that businesses, why don't businesses like regulation? Is like, well, regulation raises the cost of production. So I have one scenario which is just looking and saying, okay, suppose there's a mandate to go to electric vehicles. I mean, we've seen this mandate in California, and I'll just illustrate the scenario using a region, an economic model, or multi-regional economic model that is composed of 9 major regions of the U.S. That add up to the U.S. Total. So I have the first, which is just a flat increase in production costs for automotive, and I put like half of it into a change in production costs, and then half of it into a change in consumer prices. And then I have a second scenario, which is looking at some of these costs coming down over time when you achieve scale production, and also some reduced gasoline consumption. So these are very stylized scenarios, and it's not really supported by what quantified exactly what would happen, but it gives one a sense of like what are the issues involved here. So this one is showing I'll look at the policy variables that we selected here. So I go to the inputs list, And I've just jumped right into, I've pre-selected the policy scenarios and run the simulation. Just to show what we're putting in here, an increase in production costs for motor vehicles, bodies, and trailers. And that's for each of these regions, the United States, New England, East, South, Central, Mountain, Pacific, and so on. And that's a $10 billion increase in the cost of production. And then if we look at consumer prices, I put a $10 billion increase in consumer price for new motor vehicles. And then, so the result, and there are a lot of different things going on. Since it's a U.S. model, the population change is a rounding error. It's negligible, since if one region gains population, another loses population. GDP is down, output's down. If I just look at the employment graph, we see just a negative impact for employment. Now, this is a little bit with a caveat. This is without any Federal Reserve reaction function. So, perhaps it's unrealistic to say that we're going to, sort of have permanently increased level of employment, because the Fed would go in and adjust interest rates to bring inflation up to non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment or full employment. And we have a lever to be able to do that with a historically observed Fed response or an anticipatory response. But the main picture I wanted to show is if you just have a regulatory change that increase costs, this has a negative implication on output, and then without a Fed response on employment as well. Then I wanted to construct, maybe it's like sort of an optimistic assumption about how these regulatory targets might work. And maybe just to illustrate this, we can think about the way the automotive industry is often regulated. Is there's a new innovation, let's say airbags, and then it's introduced. It's marketed to the public as like an add-on at a high fee to your car. Do you want airbags? And you have to pay a lot of money to get that as a special feature. And then incrementally, people will pick those up, over time, and maybe they'll be adopted to some extent. And the regulatory approach is to say, okay, we have this new innovative technology, airbags, and we want to mandate that those are required to be in automobiles. And then now that it's not a special add-on, but it's a required feature, then the automotive industry can figure out the technology to have this in mass production, which will drive down the cost of that regulation. So with the initial technology, it's quite expensive to put in this technology, but when you have regulation and you give enough lead time for the automotive industry to make it standardized, the cost of that new technology is driven down. So the assumption here is we're going to have that same initial production cost and price increase. So here we have the production cost increase. This is a very long-term scenario. I take it out to all the way out to 2060, and a consumer price increase. So the same thing. It starts at a $10 billion increase in consumer prices, but then we're sort of waving our hands and making the assumption is that in the short term it increases production costs, but then as the automotive industry gets up to scale economies and works out the kinks, that those production cost increases will gradually lessen over time, and then even into the future, and I take this way out into the future, into 2060, that the production costs may go down, since the electric vehicles are much simpler. There's not the same auto parts. It's just more the engine body, and that in fact those motor vehicle prices at scale can go down. And then we also have consumer spending on gasoline, so that when we look at the total cost of operating a vehicle, there's the depreciation, or the paying for that initial investment in the vehicle, whether it's through depreciation or through an interest payment. But then you also have motor vehicle fuel savings, since depending on the region of the country and the price per kilowatt hour, some regions of the country with a lot of renewables and a lot of availability of power, such as Texas, for example, has very low electrical power cost, especially at the nighttime when the usage is down, but then the wind is blowing and there's a lot of renewables. So there's a lot. So we have a consumer savings on motor vehicles, lubricants, and fuels. I just put this in there as the 10 billion, just to sort of keep the magnitude of these changes about the same. And then we've also done this where that savings in motor vehicle fuel is reallocated into the general basket of consumer goods and services. So let's say you save $10 at the pump in motor vehicle. Now that $10 savings will be used to go out and spend for the broad variety of goods and services that a typical customer will buy. So taking the savings, and then we've increased consumer spendings. So then we can see the effect of this. And again, no Federal Reserve response, just how does the model play out without the Fed adjusting interest rates up or down. And it plays out that those production costs increases and price have a big negative hit. This is employment, so I can just pull out that employment graph separately, and has a big hit in the short term. But then when you combine those savings on gasoline and these sort of assumed technological advances, you actually switch into a more efficient and higher employment economy and higher output economy. So that's sort of one thing that's kind of behind some of this thinking about imposing these very ambitious climate targets and regulations, is that industries will adapt. They'll be able to get to scale production, and that you also have a specific goal that can be communicated across industry if there are adjustments that need to be made in transmission lines and fuel generation, that by having these targets and the legislation to make it stick, that will move forward the technological change into a new energy production system. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Dave for the last simulation, and then we can move into Q&A.
Great, yeah, thanks, Trace. Let me see here. So if we can see all this, okay. This will be the third simulation. This will be in the same vein as the second one here, but it'll instead be focused on the Bay Area here. It'll also deal with essentially a tax subsidy for the automobile industry. So essentially what we've done here is we've done another revenue neutral fiscally neutral event. So first we have a reduction in the sales tax for just the new motor vehicle industry. So not the tertiary industries, just purely production. And if we are interested in replacing a lot of these ICE vehicles, then that's what is happening right now, and it's what kind of has to happen in the future. And then to offset that subsidy cost, we've instead increased the sales tax across the board. So you can see we've included all the different kind of sectors here across all the different counties in order to offset that tax subsidy that we're looking at here. So instead of looking too much at key results, we'll just look at that briefly. We're going to go into, I might have mentioned this before, that this is a model that's equipped with the socioeconomic indicators module, and I'll go into what that looks like more in a moment. But we do see increases. If we want to compare this to the previous simulation where we also had a revenue neutral kind of tax scheme, right? We were taxing and expending in the same amount, where we were essentially taxing the fuel in the region and then distributing that to the consumer base. Instead, here we have, again, because of the scale, it's the Bay Area, and we're only doing about $200 million either way. We see some modest gains, so some modest gains in employment, and mostly across the board, we do see some slight decreases near the tail end of just GDP and the value added, but overall, increased metrics across the board. However, and this is often the concern for policymakers as well as those that are just skeptical of in varying ways of different EV focused policies. The question really becomes who is this benefiting, essentially. So the socioeconomic indicators can help us discern who is benefiting from this, essentially. Now at the bottom here, as kind of a jumping off point, we can see that the price index is decreasing for all regions in the economy overall. We're not going to look so much into regional differences. That's not kind of our focus. Like I mentioned, we're going to go into the different socioeconomic differences here. So here's some of the categories that you can be looking at. You can be looking at essentially who is benefiting in terms of the labor force and employment. But today we're going to be looking at the income or some income effects. I'm sorry. Apologies. So we're looking at the impact of inflation, which if we're looking at the price index, inflation is a measure or is related to that very, very closely. Essentially what we're seeing is while we do have overall benefits to the economy, we do have overall increases in the consumption of these new electric vehicles, which is what we like to see. We see that everyone is benefiting from this policy. However, there are some kind of more obvious features of this. So we see that all income groups in the blue, so everybody is benefiting from this in some way. However, we have it split up by income by quintile here. So we have the lowest 20%, then the second 20%, middle, the fourth, and then the highest 20%. So we can see that the rate at which consumption prices has decreased is a bit higher for the top 40% here, and then the middle is about the same. The middle and the second 20%, while the lowest 20% is enjoying the lowest amount of this policy. Similar to the earlier stimulation, where I said that if you're generally distributing government funds to the general population, then you're going to see some increases in the more obvious consumer categories such as retail trade, food and beverages, and medical care and those costs. In a similar way, because we're targeting the automobile industry and those who tend to spend the highest amount on vehicles, those who tend to also purchase the most number of vehicles are going to be those who are in higher income classes. Also those who just consume more over a period of time, buying new vehicles, keeping the vehicles for perhaps for a shorter period of time, trading them in, leases, the whole rest of that deal. So what does this illustrate? In part, it illustrates that an EV-centric policy might, while it does have benefits, as we've seen, these are all reductions in across the board consumer prices, but really seeing the more granular impacts and seeing more distributional and demographic impacts, that's a better way of not just analyzing specific policy, but also kind of bringing up into question how can we perhaps supplement this policy. Maybe there are those that can, even if we do want to pursue EV sales and EV production, perhaps there's another way to, in combination with this policy, to aid those who are not in the top 40% or so of the income base. So to kind of recap, we went through a few different of those simulations. The first was just a broad carbon tax. And again, depending on how that's modeled, whether it's at the site of point of extraction or further along down the supply chain, that can have differing impacts. We saw some studies about how the automotive industry, how that transition from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, how that is expected to look over the next number of years and decades. Kind of some of the steps that might have to be taken or should be taken to supplement that transition, and we are seeing a good amount of funding from the IRA and other legislation and policies to kind of aid in that swifter transition and ramping up of the productive process. And then just here with this example, we saw some of those policies that could be enacted, and again, bringing up into the question of how can we improve those policies and make sure that everyone is kind of brought along in a good, productive way.
Thank you. And yeah, Brian, I think we can open things up for questions.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And thank you, Tomas, Fred, Ethan, and David, for the great presentation. We're about to get into the questions, so if you have any questions, drop them now. We will not have time to get to all of them, but we'll make sure to reach out to you personally if you put one here. So it's worthwhile either way. And I also just want to quickly remind everyone that a link to the copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar will be sent to your email in about an hour after the presentation finishes. So if you have any questions from those, please reach out to info@remi.com and I'll connect you with the speakers. So now for the sake of time, we'll just get straight into the questions. So the first one is the carbon tax a transportation tax because it is assessed on fuel used for moving vehicles on roads? Is there
we're seeing the Firefox screen here.
Yep. David, I'll just make myself the presenter real quick. All right, awesome. So the first question is the carbon tax a transportation tax because it is assessed on fuel used for moving vehicles on roads? Is there a successful model that includes ongoing and long-term transportation obligations and stewardship in the discussion of a carbon tax? I can read that a bit slower too.
I'm not sure what's meant by long-term obligations.
Yeah, we can. I'll just repeat.
Yeah, I think there are various ways that it's been proposed, like the Massachusetts proposal and the Washington state proposal, and there were I haven't really seen anything which has just been as simple as just boom, a carbon tax without any effects on, protecting small businesses, protecting low-income consumer interests. So I think when you get into like, how the legislation is specifically crafted, is there are various considerations to sort of carve out exemptions and understand like long-term contracts and various obligations.
Excellent. Thank you. We do have enough time for at least another question, so I'll go to the next one. Has a separate tax number been calculated for methane from natural gas? Methane is now a greater threat than carbon dioxide, as it is 80 times more effective at trapping heat.
I mean, methane is one thing that's been addressed by regulation, and perhaps like there are different categories. Like methane would be best addressed by regulation rather than just taxation. So that makes a lot of sense if you're constructing a policy not just to look at carbon, but like consider all greenhouse gas contributors.
Yeah, I'll jump onto that as well. I know a lot of the methane emissions comes from the facilities themselves as kind of there's a better term for it, but like runoff essentially, where it's released inadvertently, and so exactly. I think as opposed to trying to tax it, putting regulations probably or on that would be perhaps more effective. I'd say like there is a glimmer of hope with methane. It does stay in the atmosphere a little bit for a shorter period of time than carbon dioxide does. So I guess that's just a little glimmer of hope for those that are concerned about methane and the various other greenhouse gases. Yeah. Relatively short.
Awesome. Thank you. We can get into the next one. So the next question, David, is in reference to your first simulation. It goes, in the Washington simulation, how large is the tax?
Yeah, I believe it was about, let me see. I believe it was about $200 million. Again, the impacts that we saw were quite small because when we're basing it off of the economy of entire state or a large portion of a state or a more built up area, then $200 million is a bit of a drop in the bucket. I'd say there are different cases where when you get to certain scales of what the policy is, then you will see somewhat not just different effects in terms of the magnitude, but like actually different effects. For example, if there's a quite large investment in construction and then a massive disinvestment in construction, then you won't just see like, oh, we're going to return back to the baseline. You'll see a return below the baseline because there's a massive disinvestment. So you might see some different impacts if we're trying to model a larger tax scheme that way. But most of these policies were just formulated, or these simulations were formulated to show, I guess, a bit of like a directional demo purpose. But I think it was around $200 million or so, either way.
Awesome. So it is 3 o'clock right now. We do have some great questions, and so we will make sure to reach out to you personally to address those. I just want to say one more time.
Brian, we could stay on for a couple of minutes if for those who'd like to continue on, just to answer a few more questions.
Sure. Yeah, and in respect of everyone's time.
But if we respect people's time limits, so thank you very much for those who'd like to conclude now, and otherwise I think we could just take a couple more questions.
Of course, yeah, we can get into some of them now. So if electric vehicle transport is cheaper in the long run, why is policy needed to promote it?
The idea here is if you introduce something incrementally, like let's say the adoption of a new technology like air travel or even the ICE back in horse and buggy days. If it's incremental and it's like first air travel is just like an extreme luxury item, and then like over time, like these early adopters who are willing to pay more, and then you have like it becomes more and more mainstream, and then over time something like air travel, gets to the level of scale that it's affordable by a broad range of households rather than just a small proportion. That incremental approach is sort of a way the technology is introduced, but the scale production is by forcing the adoption very quickly, is that you achieve those scale economies than you otherwise would have. Like airbags, then they become standard. You have scale economies. It's no longer just for like a niche group of people. So when you produce in scale, the cost is driven down. And we've seen this area, like in the area of like lithium batteries, is like 10 years ago to now, is the price has just dropped dramatically as the industry gets to a higher scale. And of course, this is Tesla's strategy, is that you can actually corner the market if you can achieve scale economies when other automotive producers are just producing at a very low level of production.
Excellent. Thank you. We can get into another question now. So in the Bay Area simulation, the price of vehicles falls due to lower tax and more subsidy, but the sales tax rises. Why is there a net reduction in the price index?
Yeah, so we spread the same amount. I think it was also $200 million. We spread that out across the entire economy. And again, this wasn't as a as a rate. It was set as a like a regular amount, $200 million. So essentially, we're taxing the entire tax base or the entire economy, and then concentrating that raised revenue in a specific portion of the economy.
My guess is that prices fell overall because there was a negative macroeconomic effect for the economy, so that as the economic competitiveness was reduced, that lowered the prices that industries could ask for. So because the economy was doing poorly, the price index went down across the board. I don't know, maybe, I mean, that's just my guess on that one. I'd have to go back and look at the simulation.
Awesome. Great. We have I'll ask this final question. So it's less of a question, but Fred Moore, if you have any thoughts to add to it, because it's based off your simulation. So in the case of regulation and mandates, higher costs translate into more spending somewhere. Example, to buy batteries and employment. And employment will rise in these sectors. Right. So it's surprising to see relatively large effects on employment.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a pretty stylized scenario in that case, and that's I agree completely. For example, the work we've done with South Coast Air Quality Management District is that, like, if there's a higher regulatory cost and you need to install pollution control equipment, well, there's spending for those people who are doing the you have to hire the labor for the people to install the equipment, so that higher cost for the business goes into somebody else's pocket. So that's very good observation, and like to do like a real scenario, that would definitely be. And that idea we see right now is like in sort of this transition, however slow or fast it's going to be to EVs. There's been a lot of new automotive investment that's announced, battery plants and other investment. So even though it represents a higher cost for the industry, we see that it's also encouraging a lot of new investment, which is job creating.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I think this is probably a good place to end the presentation. Thank you to all who attended. Again, the materials will be sent to you in about an hour. If you have any questions on those materials, please reach out to info@remi.com. Thank you again, David, Fred, Tomas, and Ethan for the great presentation. And we hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, David, Tomas, and thank you for everybody attended.
Thank you.